Kathy. I'd like to begin this morning by confessing a bad habit of mine. I confess to you that regularly I watch the news. It's true, I watch the news. And the reason I refer to that as a bad habit is because if you take in a regular, steady diet of news media, you'll probably get really depressed. Have you ever experienced that? You know, maybe you're reading the newspaper and you see, okay, the economy is in the trash can. Essentially, we know that, right? And then there's a news article about a family of 5 in eastern Illinois in a small town, all killed. Apparently, it's a murder-suicide. And then, of course, there's the tropical storm in the Philippines, and it's already killed hundreds of people, still raging. And yet another high-profile person is accused of sexual misconduct. And the people in Japan are afraid to eat food. It might be radiation poisoning, and it goes on and on. Have you ever been tempted to think, who's in charge anyway? Right? You read the newspaper and you think, it's just so confusing. There's so much chaos. It just seems like total anarchy. Nobody seems to be in charge of this world at all. And then we read the Bible, and the Bible makes a bold claim, and the Bible says that God is in charge of this world. So which is it, right? It's a fair question. How do we reconcile our belief that Jesus is the Lord of the universe, Lord of creation, with the apparent evidence to the contrary all around us? Well, to address that question, I would like to tell you a story. And the story took place a long time ago in a land far, far away. The story centers around a young Jewish man. This man is in trouble, deep trouble. In fact, he is a fugitive from the law. He is, you might say, on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. Actually, he is the 10 most wanted list. He is, bar none, public enemy number 1. In fact, the army of Israel, when it was not actively engaged in battle, they are engaged in scouring the desert looking for this fugitive. It is a massive manhunt. It's been going on for years, and it's led up by none other than King Saul himself. This man runs and he hides. He mostly hides in various caves, and he's surrounded by a bunch of rebels. They're a bunch of rabble-rousers. They're kind of good-for-nothing criminal types, really. Oh, and did I mention that this young man happens to be the king of Israel? His name is David. Now, perhaps if you thought that Saul was the king and you're confused, you could be forgiven for that, because lots of people think that. People still refer to Saul as the king. He still sits on the throne of Israel. He still commands the army of Israel, but he is not king anymore. God fired him. We read about that in 1 Samuel. God sends the prophet Samuel to the king Saul and gives him this message. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. A couple verses later, he says it again. Samuel says, I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel. So 2 times in 4 verses, the prophet Samuel proclaims to Saul, essentially, you ain't no monarch no more. You're done. You are not the king. Right after that, in the book of Samuel, God tells Samuel to go and anoint David as the new king of Israel to replace Saul. So he does that, of course. Now, David at this time is a very young man, probably a teenager. Samuel anoints David as king, but David does not take the throne right away. In fact, it's years before David will sit on any throne. 15 years, to be precise. 15-year gap between the time he was anointed and the time he finally assumed the throne, at least the throne of Judah. But as soon as David was anointed, he was God's appointed king of Israel. But he didn't look much like a powerful or reigning king, not at all. Because during that 15-year gap, Saul was prosperous, David was penniless. Saul was powerful, David was pathetic. Saul was reigning while David was running. Saul was in command and control. David was helpless and in hiding. Saul was dominant. David was doomed. Saul seemed to be approved by God, while David seemed to be abandoned by God. God seemed to favor Saul, and he seemed to forsake David. However, the truth is that God rejected Saul as king, and God recognized David as king. David, as we know, was a man after God's own heart. Saul was a man after Saul's own heart. It took 15 long years for any of that to change. Saul was killed in battle, finally, and David was publicly recognized as the king of Judah. But even then, there was still another 7-year gap before all of Israel would recognize him as the king of Israel. So altogether, David was king of Israel for about 22 years before he fully assumed the throne. Now, when we talk about David's reign, we usually refer to him as having reigned over Israel for 40 years. Technically, though, he was king for 55 years. It's just that those first 15 years, he was the rejected and exiled king. He didn't look like a king. He didn't act like a king. But he was the king, the anointed king of Israel. Now, during that 15-year gap, if you had asked anybody in Israel, who's the king? No doubt they would have said, Saul, of course. But he wasn't. He was a pretender. Saul's a poser. He was a faker, a wannabe. He was a usurper to the throne. Saul hadn't been king in years. So let me ask a question. If you can imagine yourself living back in that time, and particularly during that 15-year gap, which one of these two men would you have followed? Saul or David? Remember, Saul lives in a palace. David lives in a cave. Saul is surrounded by the army of Israel. David is surrounded by thugs. To whom would you have been loyal? Well, it would have been easy and rather natural to side with Saul, right? Go with the winner. Pander to the powerful. Curry favor with the conqueror. It would have been far easier to side with Saul, but it would have been far wiser to wait with David. Because eventually there was going to be a great reversal of fortune. Saul was killed, David was king. And many who remained loyal to Saul were punished and killed. Those who proved their loyalty to David were protected and rewarded. David was lavish with the loyal. He was treacherous with the traitors. And here's the key. The key to blessing and reward was to have already proven yourself loyal to the king when he took the throne. Let me say that again. The key to blessing and reward was to have already proven yourself loyal to the king when he assumed his throne. If you waited until coronation day to switch sides, you are already too late.